Welcome to today's FEEM seminar. It will be a policy seminar organized by the ICCG and exceptionally held via GoToMeeting. Before starting, just let me welcome our speaker, Leonardo Massai. Leonardo is, we can say, an old friend of ICCG, as he already participated in our other initiatives and seminar. He is an experienced negotiator at the UNFCCC, where he is a legal advisor to the Coalition of Rainforest Nations. He is also a lecturer at the Catholic University of Lille on EU international and environmental law, and is one of the co-founders of the startup Climalia. Today, Leonardo will give a presentation about the main outcomes of the COP23 that was just held in Bonn, and there will be therefore also the opportunity to discuss about the next steps of the Paris Agreement implementation. So I thank you all, and Leonardo, when you are ready, we can start.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to ICCG. And it's a pleasure to be with you again and to give you this short presentation about the outcomes of COP23. So COP23 was held in Bonn, although it was under the presidency of Fiji, and it's a very important meeting which is being held after the entry into force of the Paris Agreement. So in my presentation, I would like just to give you a very short introduction and background on the Paris Agreement, COP23 and the way forward. So the main outcome of this COP, which was very technical. COP23 was held under the presidency of Fiji. Unfortunately, we couldn't go to Fiji for the negotiations, but the COP23 was organized in Bonn at the headquarters of the UN Climate Change Convention Secretariat. Before I start with the presentation, let me say that any view which is expressed in this presentation is just my personal view and does not represent the view of any party in the negotiation. So this was the first oceanic COP, the first COP presided by a country in the Pacific island, and there was a lot of expectations on Fiji, on this small island state, for the organization of this very important COP, which comes after Marrakesh and before COP24, which will be held in Katowice in Poland, which is going to be a very important COP where basically many of the rules of the Paris Agreement will have to be finalized. So a lot of expectations on the Fiji presidency, and we will try to see in these few minutes if all these expectations were met or not. It was also important COP because of from a political point of view, this comes right after the decision of the US to delay the process of implementation of the Paris Agreement and to delay the approach on the international climate regime. So we also will see whether other countries were able to step up and assume that leadership. So the Paris Agreement, very briefly, is now in force, as we all know, since October 2016. Now we have 170 parties which have ratified already the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is the new international treaty which will guide the fight against climate change for the next decades. So it's a very important international treaty, very complex. A lot of negotiations were spent to arrive to the Paris Agreement in 2015, 10 years of negotiation to arrive with this new international treaty, which will design the fight against climate change for the next decades. The Paris Agreement is very complex, and it's the result of a very big compromise among all countries on the fight against climate change for the next decades. And as every single step which is taken under this convention and each COP is the result of a consensus process where all parties agree and have to be satisfied in the same manner. So the Paris Agreement is an important step in the fight against climate change, but it's also very clear, and it's also very, very clear from the start of the negotiation in Paris, but also in these 2 years after Paris, that what we are doing so far in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is not sufficient. So there is a lack of ambition. There is a mitigation gap that we have to fill, and definitely there is much more action that is needed in terms of mitigation by all parties if we want to achieve the global goal, which is set by Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which is to hold the increase in the average temperature to well below 2 degrees and to aim for 1.5. So what is very clear, and what very parties have very clear in mind, is that we need to do more action, and there is need for more mitigation if we want to get to that number. At the moment, there are many studies and reports which are telling us that we are lagging behind that goal. And even if all the NDCs will be implemented properly, we will probably get to a trajectory around 3 degrees or even more than 3 degrees. So there is clearly a need for more mitigation and more ambition. And that was also one of the main issues discussed in Bonn when we will see the main result of COP23. But clear, this is something we have to keep in mind. So the global objective of the Paris Agreement indicates the mitigation global goal, but also focuses on adaptation and the need for parties to strengthen adaptation policies against the adverse impacts of climate change. The main objective of the Paris Agreement also refers to finance and the need for finance flows to be consistent with the action of parties. So mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And the Paris Agreement, as we already mentioned briefly, is a very complex instrument divided in different sections. And the Paris Agreement is, yes, a key milestone in the fight against climate change for the next decade, but unfortunately doesn't resolve all the issues. That's why we are still in the middle of the negotiation. That's why COP23 was so important. That's why COP24 will be even more important. This is due to the fact that the Paris Agreement still leaves a lot of negotiation open, especially on many of the operational details of the Paris Agreement. And we're going to see those in this presentation. So the operational details of the Paris Agreement still have to be negotiated, and that's the same basically that happened with Kyoto, when in 1997 we agreed on the Kyoto Protocol, but many of the details of Kyoto were defined in Marrakesh in 2001. So parties are now facing a lot of challenges, and the biggest challenge is to define what is called the rule book of the Paris Agreement, or nowadays, after COP23, the work program under the Paris Agreement. So the details and all the rules of the different mechanisms established by the Paris Agreement are still to be defined. For instance, on Article 4, which is dealing with mitigation, there is the indication that NDCs, nationally determined contribution, are at the foundation of the Paris Agreement, and parties should prepare, communicate, and maintain NDCs for what they intend to achieve. But the Paris Agreement doesn't specify, for instance, how we're going to account for NDCs commitments, how we're going to measure what parties are doing when implementing their NDCs, what we're going to do with the common timeframes. In Peru, in Lima, and then in Paris, we were not able to define common timeframes. So now we have a lot of NDCs which have different data, different parameters, and are difficult to compare. So what parties now have to negotiate is something which is called common timeframes, basically the same accounting rules, so that we can have something in our hands where we can measure what parties are doing when implementing the NDCs. So this is just one example of one issue which was and is still open in the negotiation under mitigation. The Paris Agreement is covering many other aspects. As we mentioned, adaptation is a key part of the Paris Agreement, and there as well there is something which still need to be negotiated. The adaptation communications, the details of the adaptation communication are to be negotiated. There is an Article 6 which is introducing so-called cooperative approaches or various approaches the old flexible mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, basically, and that is focusing on the possibility for parties to exchange mitigation outcomes and the possibility for parties to engage into the so-called sustainable development mechanism. And there again, under Article 6, the rules are to be defined and have to be defined in the next years. There is an article on REDD+, there is an article on finance, and we're going to touch also on this issue because finance was one of the key issues discussed in Bonn. There is a global stocktake that should take place in 2023. There is a reference to capacity building, technology, loss and damage, and adaptation already mentioned, and very, very important also transparency, Article 13, which is actually the foundation and the key part of the Paris Agreement. How we're going to measure what parties are doing, not only in mitigation, but also in finance when providing support to mainly developed countries to developing countries. How we're going to measure that, how we're going to review what countries are communicating. So there are many, many doors which have been left open by the Paris Agreement. And what was decided in COP22 last year in Marrakesh is that the parties have some time to define those rules. And now we have COP24 next year, 2018, as the deadline for the completion of the negotiation on the rule book of the Paris Agreement. Whether this deadline will be met or not is open to different interpretation, but clearly there are many, many issues and many topics which still need to be defined, and parties are still very far from each other. So we will have to intensify the negotiation during 2018 with a view to arrive to COP24 in Poland with a draft package of decision which is ready for adoption. Otherwise, there may be also the possibility for the COP to decide to extend this deadline for parties to negotiate on some issues. And actually, I personally think that this will probably be the case for some issues, like for instance, Article 6. But clearly, we have to finish by 2020 when, according to the Paris Agreement, the agreement itself will have to start to be implemented. So COP23 in Bonn under the presidency of Fiji, it was the meeting of different bodies, so-called constituted bodies and subsidiary bodies of the convention. COP23, the 23rd conference of the parties to the convention, was also the 30th meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. And it was also the occasion for the CMA, the equivalent of the COP for the Paris Agreement, to briefly meet in Bonn. And in parallel, we also had the SBI, the subsidiary body for implementation, the SABSTA, which is the other subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. And finally, also we had the meeting of the APA, which is the ad hoc working group created in Paris for the continuation of the negotiation under the Paris Agreement itself. So as we can see, a lot of different bodies meeting in parallel, but it is not new to negotiators. This is actually the practice. So a lot of different meetings, a lot of different bodies discussing often also similar issues. So there is clearly, there is clearly the need for coordination among all these bodies. And one of the main successes of COP23, it was exactly to establish that coordination. So COP23 produced 31 decisions, 21 under the COP and 7 under the CMP. The CMA, which is the supreme body of the Paris Agreement, didn't produce any decision simply because the next meeting of the CMA is scheduled for COP24 in Katowice, and what was decided in Marrakesh last year was basically to give 2 years' time to all parties to ratify the Paris Agreement, so that the CMA could be as inclusive as possible and include all parties that have ratified the Paris Agreement next year in Katowice, and hopefully decide and agree on the rule book for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So the major decision which was adopted by COP23 under the convention is decision 1CP23, which is called Fiji Momentum for Implementation. And already the title gives you an indication that the meat of this decision is focused on implementation. This decision is divided into 3 chapters. It's a rather short decision compared to what we are used to have under this convention. It's a 10 pages decision, which tries to give some structure to the negotiation. So the fact that this decision is very short shouldn't also confuse the audience, because actually we have much more text, which is under the form of other draft decision text, which is not included in this decision, but this is the text that we will have to deal with and negotiate when we meet again in Bonn in the spring. So the decision 1CP23 is very short, 10 pages, but there is a lot of other material which is in draft version for the parties to consider, and we'll get to that in a moment. So decision 1CP23, first part, completion of the work program under the Paris Agreement. Basically, under this section of decision 1CP23, the COP decided to launch an online platform that will provide an overview of the negotiation, basically an overview of the work and the discussion on the rule book of the Paris Agreement. And there is an annex attached to this decision where this is explained. So there is a list of elements, and we'll get to that in a second. So an online platform, basically a website where parties will have access and more clarity about what is being discussed, where we stand, and which are the documents to be considered, and many other information. Another element of the decision is that there is probably the need to have an additional negotiating session, and that will probably happen between the spring session and COP24. That's just to give an indication that we have a lot still to negotiate. And also, this decision indicates the main elements of the work program under the Paris Agreement. And as you can see from the screen, these are all the pieces that have to come together by December next year in Poland with a view to agree on the rule book of the Paris Agreement. And those are mitigation, cooperative approaches or various approaches, basically mainly the market mechanism, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, technology, capacity building, education, transparency, global stocktake, compliance, and additional matters. Basically, all key sections of the Paris Agreement, excluding a few, including, for instance, Red Plus, where everything is ready, all those sections still have to something which is still open and to be negotiated. And that's why we probably need an additional session. We're probably going to need an additional session in the autumn, because there is still a lot to be negotiated. So very briefly, let's touch upon on the different elements of the negotiation for the rulebook of the Paris Agreement. The first one is mitigation, and as I already mentioned, the foundation of the Paris Agreement around mitigation is the concept of NDC, nationally determined contribution, which is completely the opposite of what happened in Kyoto when we had top-down targets established at the international level. Now, with NDCs, we have governments and countries which can decide on their own, voluntarily, what to do, when to do, and to what extent to do actions against climate change. So complete freedom, almost complete freedom left to countries to decide what to include in their NDCs. And that's why we are now discussing how we're going to measure the NDCs. And that's why the section on mitigation includes further guidance in relation to mitigation. We have to decide on modalities and procedure for the public registry where NDC will be registered, the common timeframes, and that's a very, very difficult discussion to decide to agree on common elements where we can measure in a uniform way all the NDCs. And just to remind you, NDCs are to be submitted by all parties. So US, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Japan, all parties, no matter whether small or big, developed or developing, have to submit their own NDCs. So there is the need for something which is uniform and common and where we can measure all parties in the same manner. Of course, there is some flexibility which is granted especially to seeds and LDCs, and this has to be taken into consideration. So the elements discussed under the mitigation section in Bonn were many, and the result of this discussion is a draft material, non-paper produced by the co-facilitators, which is actually 180 pages long. So it's very, very long draft, which includes a lot of text and a lot of proposals. And similar to what happened before December 2015 in Paris, we have there a text which is including all the proposals and all the options put down on the table by parties, and there will be the need to streamline that text and to arrive to a certain level of convergence if we want to get an agreement in COP24. And clearly there is one big problem which is common to the many different elements, which is the difference between developed and developing countries, and how we're going to treat major emitters from developing countries, for instance. So there are a lot of different interpretations there. And this is also due to the fact that the Paris Agreement did not resolve one of the biggest challenges and the biggest problem that we had with the negotiation under the Paris Agreement, which is the differentiation between developed and developing countries and the old Annex 1 division. The next section which was discussed, it is about Article 6 and various approaches or cooperation approaches, cooperative approaches. And under Article 6, we are now discussing basically three elements. The first one is the cooperative approaches itself, basically the possibility for parties to exchange ITMOs, internationally transfer mitigation outcomes, very similar to the old emissions trading established by the Kyoto Protocol. The second element there is Article 6.4, which is where parties have to define rules, modalities, and procedures for the Sustainable Development Mechanism. Again, similar to the old CDM under the Kyoto Protocol. And finally, there is also a work program under the framework for no-market approaches. What parties discussed in Bonn was the different elements of these different approaches, and there was at the end a kind of agreement among the different headings, so major elements that should be included for those three mechanisms. On Article 6, there was a roundtable organized before the start of the COP, and parties exchanged views on this very important element. The discussions are still very difficult under this system because there are many differences, and what was mainly discussed was, as I just mentioned, to agree on so-called headings. So to at least to agree on some of the key elements that will have to be considered in the next sessions. And we are talking about issues such as, for instance, environmental integrity, how to ensure environmental integrity, or for instance, how to avoid double counting and the fact that a reduction of greenhouse gas emission is not counted twice. Also, there is the relation between these mechanisms and the NDCs is also something that must be agreed. And also, for instance, the relation between these mechanisms and previous mechanisms such as CDM. So the road on this Article 6 is still very far and very long. And we hope that we will be ready to finish by COP24, but there's still some concerns about that, and there's also the possibility that this deadline will be extended. The other element, which is part of the work program under the Paris Agreement, is adaptation. And as you can see from the screen, if you can see the slide, there are many elements to be discussed under adaptation. And as I already mentioned, all these elements are discussed in different bodies. So some elements under the APA, some under the SBI, some under the SABSTA. That's why there was a need for coordination of all these different pieces. Under adaptation, the Paris Agreement indicates that parties, especially developing countries have to submit an adaptation communication. So the details of this communication is not defined by the Paris Agreement. So what parties have been discussing in Bonn has been also related to the fact of what should be included in this communication. And one element which was mentioned by many was that this communication should not create an additional burden for developing countries, and that the flexibility for developing countries should be respected. Another element which was discussed very much during this COP23 was the role of the Adaptation Fund, which was created under the Kyoto Protocol, and there was a decision under the CMP, so not under the COP, under the CMP, that indicates that the Adaptation Fund could serve also the Paris Agreement. And that was the major challenge, the major bottleneck was whether or not the Adaptation Fund was basically to be used under the Paris Agreement or not. And after intense negotiation, there is a common understanding that the approach and the way we are going to is that the also the Adaptation Fund will be serving the Paris Agreement as well. Although there is a review of this issue to be considered by the next COP. Loss and damage was also an important element to be discussed, and as you can imagine, being Fiji the president, it was an element very dear to the presidency. And in Bonn, what was agreed is that it was agreed on a work plan for 5 years, aiming at achieving an increase in active knowledge sharing. So the focus is on the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which is associated with climate change impacts. And the discussion there is how to make use and how to give powers to the executive committee under the Warsaw International Mechanism. The discussion is still whether or not there would be the possibility for developed countries to finance some of the damage and the losses caused by climate change in vulnerable countries, but we are still far from finalizing the question of financing. As you can imagine, developed countries are not inclined to provide new funding for this sectional list in this area, but they are providing funding on other areas. So the discussion was basically that this work plan will be considered, and in May 2018, a working group under the loss and damage will prepare recommendations with the view to limiting the causes of migration in connection with the negative impacts of climate change. And in addition to this, there will be an expert dialogue to be organized. Finance was also another important element discussed across different bodies under COP23. And clearly, here you can see from the screen which were the main issues discussed under finance regarding to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, modalities for accounting of financial resources. So under Article 9.7 finance, there is the request for developed countries to account for the financial resources provided. There is also a section on the process to identify information to be provided by parties in accordance with Article 9.5. And there was the issue of adaptation fund, which I just mentioned. Clearly, finance was also tackled by other part and sections of the COP23, by some COP items as well, like long-term finance, for instance. Also, the issue of the report of the GCF to the COP, and the issue of the report, the annual report of the Standing Committee on Finance. So the discussion on finance was very complex, and basically developing countries were trying to get a promise, a model promise by developed countries that the global goal and the joint mobilization goal established by the Paris Agreement, that the $100 billion US to be provided annually by 2020 is confirmed. Developed countries were urged to continue to have their efforts to provide funding. And also one important point was discussed is that developed countries have to provide every 2 years biannually submission on strategies and approaches for scaling up climate finance for 2018-2020. And there was a lot of discussion was going on around that. In 2018, that was decided by COP23. There will be an in-session workshop on finance, and there will be also and high-level ministerial dialogue, especially to consider the topic of access to climate finance. So the 2018 high-level ministerial dialogue is also one of the major results of the discussion in finance by COP23. Technology transfer is also part of the package of decision to be adopted under the Paris Agreement. The discussion there was on the scope and modalities for the periodic assessment of the technology mechanism and the operationalization of the technology framework, which has been established under Article 10 of the Paris Agreement. Capacity building, there is a discussion ongoing on institutional arrangements on capacity building since this was created by the Paris Agreement, and again, what it was discussing how to operationalize these arrangements. Part of the work program of the Paris Agreement is also the section on education and public awareness, and referring to matters mentioned in Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, and then the discussion is how to enhance the implementation of education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information. And that discussion is under the SBI. Another very important element of discussion under the Paris Agreement work program is transparency. As I mentioned already, the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement established the new transparency framework for action and support under the Paris Agreement, but unfortunately doesn't give the details. So parties now have to discuss the modalities, procedure, and guidelines for that transparency framework. And the result of the discussion in Bonn is a 46 pages text material that will be considered in the next session in the spring, where the question is how to treat developing countries, particularly whether or not to give more flexibility to developing countries in reporting, and how to do the international assessment. Another very important problem, which is in transparency, is that the transparency framework under the Paris Agreement applies to all parties, but also refers to the fact that the existing institutional arrangements under the convention should be used as a basis, and that those existing arrangements are focused and based on the division between developed and developing countries. So there is an issue there, how do we treat differentiation and how to ensure that the applicability of this framework to all parties is maintained by this discussion. But that's another important discussion for next session. Can you still hear me well?
Yes, Leonardo, we can hear you. We just unmuted our microphone to avoid noise.
Okay, I'm just going briefly to conclude so that then I can leave some space for questions. Global stocktake is an important element to be discussed because in 2023 there will be the first stocktake. So countries will, parties will get together and see where we are and whether we need to do more. Most likely yes. So the global stocktake was discussed by COP23 in different bodies. And one important element is that matters referred to the global stocktake were considered by the APA. And what it was discussed was how we are going to ensure that the new report to be released by the IPCC, if I'm not mistaken, next year, will be included in this review. And in Bonn, the delegation discussed basically so-called building blocks on how this process will be formed. Linked to this global stocktake discussion is also another important element of Decision 1 CP23, that is the Talanoa dialogue that I'm going to touch upon in a few seconds. Just to complete on the work program under the Paris Agreement is the compliance. As we all know, there is a compliance article under the Paris Agreement, which indicates that the new compliance mechanism will be facilitative, so nothing to compare to the existing compliance committee under the Kyoto Protocol, which is a quasi-judicial punitive body. The new system will be facilitative, but still parties have to we're discussing how this mechanism will function, and the operationalization of this compliance committee, it will be it's also one of the key subjects of the discussion for COP24. So the Talanoa dialogue is the other important section of Decision 1 CP23. Basically, is the Talanoa dialogue is what it was previously known as facilitative dialogue as of Paris, and this will begin in January 2018, and it will go on for all 2018. And the main objective of this dialogue among parties is to take stock of the collective efforts of parties in relation to progress towards the global goal on mitigation and towards the preparation of NDCs. What was decided in COP23 is to launch this dialogue. Talanoa comes from Fiji, and there is a draft paper called The Approach of the Talanoa Dialogue attached to the decision 1CP23, which indicates the features, the inputs, and the so-called preparatory and political phases for this dialogue. So very briefly, the Talanoa dialogue will have to be constructive, facilitative, and solutions-oriented. It should not lead to discussion of a confrontational nature, so it will be facilitative, not confrontational. Basically, parties hearing to each other. And it will be undertaken under the Pacific tradition of Talanoa, which is a principle where everything is done in transparent manner, in peace, and in harmony, and in a way which is inclusive, participatory, and transparent for all parties. The dialogue should promote cooperation, and the dialogue will mainly be structured around three general topics: where are we in terms of reductions, where do we want to go, and how do we get there. The dialogue will also focus on the pre-2020 action. It will be comprehensive and non-restrictive. And the inputs to the dialogue will come from the new special report, the special report by the IPCC on global warming, that will be released as requested by the COP in the next months. It will be based on inputs by parties, stakeholders, and experts, institutions. It will be based on inputs by the presidency of COP23 and COP24, and an online platform will facilitate access to this dialogue also by all stakeholders. There will be a preparatory phase, which is 1 year from January 2018 until COP24, until December, where all parties will be there, and where there will be an exchange of views on the features and on the inputs. And the objective is to arrive to COP24 when there will be a political phase, so-called, where ministers will get together and decide and take decisions, most likely a COP24 decision on how to improve ambition and strengthen action against climate change. So all these pieces will fit together and produce this material for the ministers to meet in COP24 in Poland, when the dialogue will be concluded. This dialogue will be very important element and inputs also for the global stocktake, which will take place in 2023. The final part of decision 1CP23 is focusing on pre-2020 implementation and ambition. There was a draft decision proposed by many developing countries, and basically what it was decided in Bonn is that there will be 2 stocktakes, one in COP24 and one in COP25. We're looking at the implementation and ambition for pre-2020 action, looking at the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol, but also action by developed and developing countries pre-2020 in mitigation, technology transfer, capacity building as well. And the result of this stocktake will be some reports which will be presented to both COP24 and COP25 for adoption. This is the main foundation of COP decision 1CP23. There have been other COP decisions adopted by COP23, one on long-term finance, which is focusing on finance, the one on the Warsaw International Mechanism for the work plan for 5 years that I just mentioned. There is a decision on local communities and indigenous peoples. There is the establishment of a gender action plan, and there is for the first time a decision on agriculture, which is also a very important result and success of COP23. Agriculture has been since forever a very, very delicate issue, but there was finally the possibility for parties to agree on some common elements and some work plan for the next years on agriculture. That's a good step forward. Just to mention maybe a couple of things before going to the conclusions. Red Plus would also discuss COP23, but unfortunately there was no agreement. So this issue will be considered again in the next meeting in the spring. And basically what was discussed there is the issue of coordination of support. All the rules for methodological rules for REDD+ are already established, but what is still to be discussed is how coordination of support for REDD+ is functioning, whether it's functioning well or not, and whether or not we need some institutional arrangements for this to function better. So this discussion is being postponed to the next session in spring and to COP24. And also another element which was introduced by some parties in the negotiation and which will be very important element in the next years is the contribution of stakeholders and non-party stakeholders to the process, to the Paris Agreement. And that is a very hot topic issue which will be discussed again in COP24 and which is clearly one element that we all parties have to consider sooner or later, how to make sure that also non-parties like regional states, provinces, private companies, corporations can feed and help the world to get to this global goal of 2 degrees and be part of the Paris Agreement process. That's a very important element which was not yet mature to be considered for a decision in Bonn. So just to conclude, not all the expectations which were there for the first oceanic COP held by Fiji in Bonn were met, and especially on loss and damage and other elements which are very dear for developing countries, especially small island states. COP23 didn't meet all the expectations. The preliminary material which is there for parties to be considered for adoption by COP24 is huge, is very big and thick, to 266 pages. So we have a lot of material there, meaning a lot of draft text with proposals, parentheses, options that will have to be streamlined by the parties before COP24. So that's another element to be considered. Was the vacuum left by the US filled by EU and China? I would rather say not really. EU, especially the leadership of Germany, was a little bit in jeopardy given the political situation in the country. So the EU is still seen by many actors as not as strong as it was before, a weak actor. China was also more focused on some domestic elements. So clearly there is a political vacuum and momentum that must be kept alive if we want the Paris Agreement to succeed. COP24 still remains decisive. Maybe yes, maybe not. Probably COP24 will be will need some more time to decide on some other elements. But we will have to see that in December in Poland. But clearly there is a lot of details still to be negotiated. And the focus is, as I was just mentioning before, shifting a lot to non-party players and ad hoc alliances which have been established outside of the convention, outside of the UN bodies, but they are functioning very well. And the last one which was established, it is a alliance on phasing out coal production, powering past coal alliance, where parties get together and decide to take action outside of the process, which is too often too cumbersome and long and complex. So with that, I would like to conclude here, and I'm open for questions. Thank you.